The rain in Lockdub was not merely falling, it was performing a relentless grey siege. It turned the heather into a sodden sponge, and the loch into a churning cauldron of leaden water. Inside the police station, PC Hamish Macbeth sat with his long, lanky legs stretched out toward the peat stove, which was emitting a cosy, earthy aroma that battled the smell of his wet dog, Lugs. Hamish was currently engaged in the most vital task of his day, staring at a pot of coffee and willing it to percolate faster. His red hair was a riot of unruly curls, and his uniform, which had seen better decades, was currently draped over the back of a chair to dry. To any passing stranger, he looked like a man who had successfully retired while still on the payroll. This was a carefully cultivated image. Hamish knew that in the Highlands, the more useless you appeared, the less people bothered you with things like paperwork or civic responsibilities. The telephone on his desk gave a sharp, demanding jingle. Hamish looked at it with the weary sadness of a man watching a beautiful sunset being interrupted by a tax audit. He considered letting it ring after all. The sheep were unlikely to report a crime, and most locals preferred to settle their differences with a pra, stout stick, or a long silence, but the persistence of the ring suggested a Sassenach on the other end. No Highlander rang that long without stopping for a dream. Lockdub Police Station, Macbeth speaking, he sighed into the receiver. "About time!" A shrill, clipped English voice barked. "I've been trying to reach the constabulary for 10 minutes. Is this how you people operate, or are you all currently indisposed by a local distillery?" Hamish closed his eyes. "It's a heavy rain, sir. The lines are a bit temperamental. How can I help you?" "I am Marcus Sterling. I am the director of the new Highland Serenity Spa and Wellness Retreat at the old manor house. We have a situation. A guest, a very prominent, very wealthy guest named Penelope Arbuthnot has failed to appear for her seaweed wrap. Her room is empty, her luggage is still there, and more importantly, my morning schedule is in absolute tatters." Hamish leaned back, the word seaweed wrap sounding like a bizarre punishment rather than a luxury. "Perhaps she's just out for a walk, Mr. Sterling. The hills are grand for the Constitution. In this? She's a woman who considers a walk from the limousine to the lobby an endurance test. She is missing, Constable. I expect you here immediately. And do try to look presentable. This is a 5-star establishment, not a crofter's barn." The line went dead. Hamish looked at Lugs, who thumped his ragged tail against the floorboards. "Did you hear that, Lugs? A seaweed wrap. The world is going mad, and they want us to go out in the wet to find out why." With a groan of genuine physical pain, Hamish pulled on his damp tunic and tucked his trousers into his boots. He grabbed his yellow oilskin, which made him look like a very tall, very depressed canary, and whistled for the dog. The drive up to the manor was a treacherous crawl. The new owners of the estate had spent a fortune on gold leaf signage and gravel paths that were currently washing away into the gully, but they hadn't bothered to clear the overhanging branches that scraped against the side of Hamish's police Land Rover. The manor itself, once a sturdy stone fortress of Highland stoicism, had been painted a startling shade of eggshell and draped in silk banners that whipped violently in the gale. As Hamish pulled up, a silver Porsche was parked crookedly across the entrance, blocking the way. A man in an impeccably tailored cream-coloured tracksuit stepped under the portico, looking at the muddy Land Rover with profound distaste. This, Hamish assumed, was Marcus Sterling. He had the tanned, taut skin of a man who spent too much time under sun lamps, and a pair of eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating the cost of everything he looked at. "You're late," Sterling said as Hamish climbed out, looking particularly unkempt as the wind immediately flattened his hair against his forehead. "And you've brought a creature." He pointed a manicured finger at Lugs, who had jumped out and was currently sniffing a very expensive-looking topiary bush. "He's a police dog," Hamish said, mildly. "Of a sort. Now, about this Mrs. Arbuthnot. When was she last seen?" "At dinner last night," Sterling snapped, leading Hamish into the lobby, which smelled aggressively of eucalyptus and desperation. "She was complaining about the lack of organic kale. She's a regular on the London social circuit, Macbeth. If anything has happened to her under my roof, the publicity will be catastrophic. She's a widow, quite lonely, but immensely rich. She came here for the silent retreat package." "Well," Hamish said, looking at the plush carpets and the hushed, terrified-looking staff scurrying about in white linen uniforms. "It seems she's taken the silence a bit too literally, doesn't it?" Sterling glared at him. "This is not a joke. She isn't in her room, her bed wasn't slept in, and the back door to the gardens was found unbolted this morning. I want a full search. I want divers in the loch." Sterling's demands were cut short by a muffled, high-pitched scream echoing from the direction of the Zen hydrotherapy wing. Hamish didn't run, he walked at a brisk, economical pace that allowed him to observe the panic of the yoga instructors as they bolted for the exits. He reached the hydrotherapy room, a place of steam and expensive tiling, to find a young therapist pointing a shaking finger at one of the large, industrial mud baths used for detoxifying treatments. The mud was thick, dark and bubbling slightly from the heating elements. In the center of the vat, a pair of bright pink fluffy slippers were floating serenely on the surface. And beneath them, slowly sinking into the dark ooze, was the unmistakable outline of a very expensive, very still human head. Hamish sighed, the steam fogging up his vision. "Well, Mr. Sterling," he murmured, his voice dry as a Highland summer, "I think we've found your guest, though I doubt she'll be needing that seaweed wrap now." The piece of lockdub hadn't just been shattered, it had been drowned in expensive Swedish peat. The thick, dark slurry of the mud bath gurgled with a sickening wet pop as the weight of the body shifted deeper into the vat. Hamish stood at the edge of the tiled platform, his face a mask of mild professional detachment that hid a growing sense of weariness. He had seen many things in the hills of Sutherland, accidents on the crags, poaching disputes gone sour, and the occasional victim of a long-standing Highland feud, but the site of a wealthy London socialite being reclaimed by the earth in a temperature-controlled spa wing was a new level of the macabre. Marcus Sterling had turned a ghastly shade of grey, his manicured hands fluttering near his throat like trapped birds. The young therapist who had discovered the body had retreated to a corner, her breath coming in jagged, hysterical hitches that echoed off the sterile, eucalyptus-scented walls. Hamish knelt by the edge of the bath, ignoring the way the dampness of the floor seeped into his trousers. He didn't touch the body knew better than to disturb the scene before the big men arrived, but he leaned in close, his keen eyes scanning the surface of the mud. The bright pink slippers were mocking in their fluffiness, bobbing near where the victim's face had vanished beneath the surface. Penelope Arbuthnot had clearly been dressed for comfort, not for a midnight dip in a vat of volcanic clay. There was no sign of a struggle in the immediate vicinity, no overturned massage tables or broken vials of essential oils. Everything was perfectly, chillingly in its place, save for the corpse currently marinating in the Zen hydrotherapy wing. "I don't understand," Sterling whimpered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "The vat is heated to precisely 38 degrees. It's designed for relaxation, not for this." She must have slipped. She must have been trying to get an early start on her treatment and had a dizzy spell. Hamish straightened up, his height making the low-ceiling treatment room feel suddenly claustrophobic. A dizzy spell that led her to climb over a 3-foot ceramic rim in her pajamas and slippers. "Mr. Sterling?" And then to sink perfectly vertically without so much as a splash on the floor tiles. He looked down at the pristine, white-tiled surroundings. There was not a drop of mud outside the vat. It's a very tidy way to die, surely. Almost as if someone had tucked her in for the night. Sterling's eyes went wide. "Are you Sagistino? That's impossible." "This is a sanctuary. We have security. We have a reputation." "You have a dead woman in a bucket of dirt," Hamish corrected him softly, his Highland lilt gaining a sharp, skeptical edge. "And until I am told otherwise, I am treating this room as a crime scene. I'll be needing the guest list, the staff rota, and a very large pot of coffee. And don't be touching anything, or I'll be forced to get official with you, which is a bother for everyone involved." Hamish walked to the door and whistled for Lugs. The dog, who had been waiting patiently in the corridor, trotted in and immediately began to sniff the air with a low, mournful whine. Lugs didn't like the smell of the spa, it was too clean, too artificial. He circled the mud bath once, his hackles rising before sitting firmly at Hamish's heel. "Aye, Lugs, you've the right idea," Hamish murmured. "Something is smelling very wrong here, and it's not just the seaweed." He spent the next hour performing the tedious but necessary task of cordoning off the wing with a roll of yellow tape head found in the back of the Land Rover. He moved with a deceptive slowness, appearing to be more interested in the quality of the wallpaper than the details of the crime, but his mind was cataloguing every detail. He noted the heavy reinforced door to the hydrotherapy wing. It had a digital keypad, one that required a code. Penelope Arbuthnot would have had the code as a guest, but so would every member of the staff. He also noticed a small, discarded piece of plastic near the drainer broken seal from a bottle of something, though not the kind usually found in a 5-star spa. He pocketed it with a casual flick of his wrist, his expression remaining as blank as a Highland mist. The piece of the morning was officially declared dead when the sound of a high-performance engine roared up the manor's driveway, followed by the screech of brakes that suggested the driver was in a violent hurry to be somewhere they hated. Hamish sighed, leaning against the doorframe and pulling his crumpled cap lower over his eyes. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the Strathbane CID arriving to make a mess of his quiet day. "Macbeth!" a voice bellowed from the lobby, a sound like a foghorn in a library. "Where are you, you long-legged, heather-stepping imbecile? If you've so much as breathed on the evidence, I'll have you directing traffic in a Glasgow roundabout before the sun sets." Detective Chief Inspector Blair marched into the hydrotherapy wing, his face a vivid, pulsating purple that matched the silk tie straining against his thick neck. Behind him trailed Detectives Anderson and McLean, looking like two bedraggled crows caught in a downpour. Blair didn't stop to look at the body. He marched straight up to Hamish, his heavy boots echoing with an aggressive, rhythmic thud that seemed designed to intimidate the very floor tiles. "DCI Blair, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into the soft, respectful tone of a simple village bobby. "A tragic business. Mrs. Arbuthnot. She seems to have— I don't care what she seems to have done, Macbeth," Blair shouted, spray hitting Hamish's cheek. "I've had the Chief Constable on the phone for the last hour. This woman was the widow of Sir Alistair Arbuthnot. She had friends in the Home Office. She had a flat in Mayfair that costs more than this entire miserable county. And she ends up as a face mask in a glorified bathtub because you were too busy poaching salmon to keep an eye on the locals." Hamish blinked slowly, the image of the simpleton firmly in place. "I didn't think the locals were the problem here, sir. Most of them cannot afford the kale juice, let alone a room in the manor. It's a very exclusive place, you see." Blair turned his back on Hamish, dismissing him with a flick of his meaty hand. He stomped over to the mud bath, peering in with a look of profound disgust. A slip and fall, clearly. The woman was old, probably drugged up on those wellness pills they sell here, and she took a header into the muck. "It's an accidental death, McLean. Get the photographers in here, get the body out of that filth, and let's see if we can get back to Strathbane in time for a proper lunch. I am not spending my day in a place that smells like French perfumery." "But the slippers, sir," Hamish offered tentatively, hovering at Blair's shoulder like a persistent gnat. "They are very neat, don't you think?" And the door was locked. She'd have had to punch in her code while feeling dizzy. Blair turned, his eyes bulging. The slippers were floating. "You turnip! Physics, Macbeth, ever heard of it?" And of course the door was locked. It's a high-end spa, not a Highland pub. She went in, she fell, she died. "Now, get out of my sight. Go and stand by the front gate and try to look like a real policeman. If any reporters show up, you tell them nothing. Actually, don't even tell them your name. Yow'd probably forget it halfway through anyway." Hamish touched his cap, his blue eyes showing nothing but a dull, obedient spark. "As you say, sir. I'll just go and see if the dog needs a walk." He whistled for lugs and retreated from the room, leaving Blair to bark orders at his subordinates. As he walked through the opulent lobby, past the terrified yoga instructors and the fuming Marcus Sterling, Hamish felt the small plastic seal in his pocket. He knew it wasn't an accident. Penelope Arbuthnot hadn't slipped, she had been placed. And the person who had placed her was likely someone who knew exactly how to navigate the silent, high-priced corridors of the Highland Serenity Spa. Blair was looking for an easy exit, but Hamish knew the Highlands. Here, the mud didn't just swallow you by accident, it was usually helped along by a pair of very determined hands. Hamish retreated from the Zen hydrotherapy wing with the air of a man who had been thoroughly chastened, his head bowed just enough to satisfy DCI Blair's ego, while his eyes remained sharply focused on the luxury vinyl flooring. He could hear Blair's voice echoing behind him, already settling on a narrative that involved a tragic combination of elderly frailty and slippery ceramic tiles. To Blair, the world was a collection of inconvenient accidents that delayed his arrival at the nearest pub, but Hamish knew that the Highland Serenity Spa was far too controlled an environment for such a tidy mishap. He stepped out into the damp morning air, the Highland mist clinging to his yellow oilskins like a cold, wet shroud. Lugs trotted beside him, giving a low, sceptical woof as they passed the silver Porsche, which was now being draped in police tape by a disgruntled Detective McLean. The big men from Strathbane were busy bullying the spa director and frightening the kitchen staff, which meant Hamish was free to do what he did best: vanish into the background. He didn't head back to the village immediately. Instead, he detoured toward the staff quarters located in the converted stables behind the manor. If Penelope Arbuthnot had been a regular on the London social circuit, she wouldn't have been handled by just any therapist. She would have had a favourite, or at least an enemy, among those tasked with catering to her every whim. In the small communal break room of the staff quarters, he found a young man named Cyril, who was currently nursing a cup of herbal tea with the grim intensity of a man facing the gallows. Cyril was the mindfulness coordinator, but at the moment he looked anything but mindful. His hands were shaking, and his carefully coiffed hair was beginning to frizz in the humidity. "A terrible business, Cyril," Hamish said, letting his Highland lilt become soft and comforting as he leaned against the doorframe. Mrs. Arbuthnot was a grand lady, by all accounts. It's a shame her retreat had to end in such a messy fashion. Cyril looked up, his eyes wide and watery. She wasn't a grand constable. She was a nightmare. She spent the entire week complaining that the crystals in the meditation room were vibrationally inconsistent. She threatened to sue Marcus every time her kombucha wasn't chilled to exactly 4 degrees. But she didn't deserve to go like that. She had a lot of money, I hear, Hamish remarked casually, looking out the window at the swirling fog. Money brings out the best in some and the worst in others. Did she have any visitors? Or perhaps a friend who shared her passion for consistent vibrations? Cyril hesitated, his gaze dropping to his tea. She had a guest yesterday afternoon. Not a spa guest. A man in a very expensive suit. They argued in the tea lounge for nearly an hour. She was shouting about a Willa codicil. She told him he wouldn't get a penny of the Arbuthnot estate if he didn't straighten himself out. He left looking like he wanted to burn the building down. Hamish nodded slowly, filing the information away. And would this man have a name, Cyril? Or a face that might stick in the memory? He called himself Julian, Cyril whispered. Julian Arbuthnot. Her nephew, I believe. He's staying at the hotel in the village because Marcus wouldn't give him a room here. Penelope forbade it. Hamish thanked the young man and slipped away before Blair could find a reason to drag him back into the hydrotherapy wing. He climbed into his Land Rover and rattled down the hill toward the village of Lochstub. The mist was thickening, turning the loch into a ghostly mirror that reflected nothing but the grey sky. As he reached the main street, he saw the familiar sight of the post office and general store, its windows glowing with a warm amber light that promised gossip and strong tea. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was already holding court when Hamish entered. She was a woman whose knowledge of the village's business was so comprehensive it bordered on the supernatural. She looked up from a stack of pension books, her spectacles glinting with a predatory intelligence. "So, the Sassenach lady has drowned in a bucket of mud, has she, Hamish?" Mrs. Kennedy said, not even bothering with a greeting. "And I suppose that great loud-mouthed creature Blair is currently trying to arrest the gardener for it." "He's leaning toward a slip and fall, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, adopting his most vacant expression as he reached for a packet of ginger nuts, though he's currently shouting at a yoga instructor about the lack of proper warning signs. "Would you be having a pot of tea on the hob?" "I might," she said, beckoning him into the back room. "And I might also have a bit of information about your nephew Julian. He's been in and out of here 3 times this morning, trying to use the payphone to call a solicitor in London. He's a flashy bit of work, Hamish. Smells of expensive tobacco and desperation. He was asking if the police had found a valuable item on the body. He seemed very concerned about a necklaceth Arbuthnot emeralds, he called them." Hamish took a slow sip of the scalding tea she provided. "The emeralds, you say? I didn't see any jewellery on the body, though I wasn't looking too closely before Blair shoved me out. If they're missing, it gives our friend Julian a very green motive." "He's not the only one with a motive," Mrs. Kennedy added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The minister, Mr. Lovett, was up at the spa yesterday too. It seems Mrs. Arbuthnot was considering a large donation to the kirk, but she was demanding a lot of say in how the money was spent. She wanted the pews replaced with ergonomic meditation cushions. Lovat was purple with rage when he left. He said the woman was an instrument of the devil." Hamish sighed, the warmth of the tea doing little to settle the cold feeling in his gut. A greedy nephew, a furious minister, and a spa director terrified of a scandal. It was a Highland stew of a case, and DCI Blair was currently trying to eat it with a fork. He knew he had to keep moving, to keep mooching until the threads began to pull together. He left the post office and walked toward the Lochstub Hotel, where Julian Arbuthnot was reportedly sulking. As he crossed the street, he spotted a familiar figure standing by the stone wall of the harbour. It was Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, looking as elegant as ever in a barber jacket and a silk headscarf. She was staring out at the loch, her expression thoughtful and distant. "A penny for them, Priscilla?" Hamish called out, his voice carrying on the damp wind. She turned, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I was just thinking about Penelope, Hamish. She was a friend of my mother's, in a roundabout way. She was a difficult woman, but she wasn't stupid. She knew Julian was a gambler, and she knew the spa was a vanity project for Marcus Sterling. She told me last week that she felt like she was being hunted for her checkbook." "Hunted, you say?" Hamish joined her at the wall, lugs settling at their feet. That's a strong word for a wellness retreat. She didn't feel safe, Hamish. She thought someone was watching her. Not just for the money, but for the emeralds. They've been in the family for generations, and Thea cursed, or so the story goes. Whoever wears them ends up in a cold embrace. Hamish looked back toward the manor, its eggshell-painted walls barely visible through the mist. The cold embrace of the mud bath seemed a fitting, if gruesome, end to the legend. He felt the plastic seal in his pocket again. It was a seal from a bottle of sedative kind used by veterinarians. He knew because Head seen the same seals in the back of the local vet's van. "I think he'll be having a word with our friend Julian," Hamish said, tipping his cap to Priscilla. "And maybe a quick chat with the minister. Blair is looking for a tragedy, but I am beginning to think we're looking at a very well-orchestrated performance. One where the leading lady was never meant to take a bow." He walked away, his lanky stride purposeful even as he maintained the slouch of a man with nothing but time. The investigation was moving out of the steam-filled rooms of the spa and into the cold, honest air of Lochstub. Blair was busy with the mud, but Hamish was starting to look at the people who stood on the dry ground, watching the bubbles rise. Hamish left Priscilla standing by the harbour wall, her warning about the cold embrace of the Arbuthnot emeralds lingering in the damp air, like the smell of wood smoke. He made his way toward the Lochstub Hotel, a sturdy stone building that had seen more history than most of its guests could imagine. The lobby was a sanctuary of worn chintz and the faint, persistent scent of stale beer and floor wax. There, seated in a high-backed armchair by a dying fire, was Julian Arbuthnot. He was a man who looked like he had been assembled from the remnants of an expensive lifestyle that was rapidly falling apart. His tweed jacket was perfectly cut but slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his eyes had the restless, predatory look of a gambler waiting for a card that never comes. "P.C. Macbeth, is it?" Julian said, not looking up from a glass of whiskey that was too large for the hour. "I suppose you're here to tell me that my aunt's unfortunate tumble baffles the local constabulary. Terrible business. Penelope always was a bit clumsy after her evening gin." Hamish pulled up a stool, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the fire for a moment before speaking, letting the silence stretch out until Julian shifted uncomfortably. "It's a strange thing, Mr. Arbuthnot. Your aunt wasn't much of a drinker, according to the staff at the spa. They say she was more interested in vibrations and kale than gin. And yet, she seems to have managed a very difficult climb into a mud bath while wearing her slippers. I don't suppose Yao'd know anything about a missing necklace? The emeralds people are whispering about?" Julian's hand tightened around his glass. "People gossip in these little puddles, don't they? The emeralds were her business. If they are missing, perhaps one of those mindful therapists decided to take a commission. Now, if Yao'll excuse me, I have calls to make. My aunt's estate is complex." "I am sure it is," Hamish replied mildly, standing up, "especially the parts that involve changing her will. Cyril at the spa mentioned you had a bit of a disagreement about that yesterday. It's a pity the conversation ended so abruptly." He left Julian staring into his whiskey and stepped back out into the street, only to be nearly run down by a small, bright red car that skidded to a halt inches from his boots. Elspeth Grant leaned out of the window, her dark hair windswept and her eyes dancing with the peculiar excitement she always felt when there was a tragedy to report. "Hamish! I heard the news. A socialite in the mud. It's the best story I've had since the minister's goat got into the communion wine," Elspeth chirped, ignoring the rain. "Tell me everything." "Blair is currently barricaded in the manor office shouting at anyone who doesn't have a title, so you're my only hope for the human interest angle." Hamish leaned his elbows on the roof of her car, a look of weary affection on his face. "It's a murder, Elspeth, not a human interest story. And I've got nothing for you but a cold wind and a plastic seal from a vet's bottle. Unless you happen to know why a woman who hated you would leave you a message in the hotel guest book." Elspeth's smile faltered. "Penelope didn't hate me. She found me useful. We were working on her memoirs. She wanted to expose all the people who had been leeching off her for years. Julian, Marcus Sterling, even some local charities. She was going to name names, Hamish. She told me she had proof of a massive embezzlement scheme at the spa. Marcus has been cooking the books to pay off his own debts. That was the key Hamish had been looking for. The hunted feeling Priscilla had mentioned, and the complex estate Julian was so worried about weren't just about the emeralds. Penelope Arbuthnot had been a threat to anyone relying on her purse. "I need to see that guest book, Elspeth," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "And I need you to stay away from Marcus Sterling for a bit. If Penelope was murdered to keep her quiet, anyone she was talking to is in the same line of fire. Is that a warning or a romantic concern, Macbeth?" Elspeth asked, her bravado returning, though her eyes remained wary. "It's a bit of both," Hamish admitted, pushing himself away from the car. "Now, go and get a cup of tea at the hotel and stay put. I have to go and see a man about a gota, rather, a minister about a donation. As Elspeth drove off, Hamish felt the weight of the investigation shifting. He had a greedy nephew, a desperate spa director, and a journalist who knew too much. He also had the plastic seal in his pocket, a tiny piece of evidence that suggested the killer wasn't just desperate, but had access to the tools of a very different trade. He walked toward the manse, his mind turning over the image of Mr. Lovat's rage. In Lochdub, even the most holy of men had a breaking point when it came to their pride. The wind began to howl through the narrow lanes, carrying the salt spray of the loch with it. Hamish knew the mooching was almost over. He had listened to what everyone was saying, and more importantly, he had listened to what they weren't. Marcus Sterling hadn't mentioned the embezzlement, Julian hadn't mentioned his gambling debts, and the minister hadn't mentioned exactly how much he needed that donation to save the Kirk's roof. They were all standing on a foundation of lies, and Hamish Macbeth was about to start pulling at the loose threads. He whistled for Lugs, who was late to sniff a discarded pie tin. "Come on, Lugs. We've a Kirk to visit. And I've a feeling the Reverend is going to find his afternoon prayers very much interrupted by the secular world." He reached the manse, a brooding stone building tucked away behind a row of ancient, wind-bent rowan trees. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for the meticulously private Mr. Lovat. Hamish pushed it open, the hinges giving a long, mournful creak that seemed to echo the darkness he felt growing at the heart of the wellness retreat. The investigation was no longer about a woman in a mud bath. It was about the dark, petty human secrets that were bubbling to the surface, and Hamish was the only one willing to get his hands dirty to find the truth. The interior of the manse was as cold and austere as a midwinter sermon, smelling of floor wax and the faint, dusty scent of old hymnals. Hamish stepped into the hallway, his boots silent on the threadbare carpet, while Lugs followed with a cautious sniff at the air. The open door was a worrying sign in a village where privacy was guarded more fiercely than a secret fishing hole, and as Hamish moved toward the study, he heard the frantic rustle of paper. He paused, his back against the wood-panelled wall, listening to the sound of a man in the grip of a desperate hurry. When he finally rounded the corner, he found the Reverend Mr. Lovat kneeling on the floor, surrounded by a whirlwind of ledgers and bank statements. The minister looked up, his face ashen and his clerical collar undone, hanging limp like a wilted lily. For a moment, the fire of the pulpit was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man who had seen the bottom of an empty collection plate. He scrambled to his feet, trying to shield the papers with his thin frame, but Hamish had already seen enough. The ledgers were marked with the red ink of debt, kind of debt that the ergonomic meditation cushions of a wealthy widow were supposed to erase. "Macbeth!" "You've a habit of entering a house like a thief in the night," Lovat rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "I am in the middle of preparing the parish accounts. It is a private matter, and one that does not require the interference of the civil authorities." Hamish leaned against the heavy oak desk, his gaze drifting to a small, silver-framed photograph of the Kirk's roof, which looked more like a sieve than a shelter. It's a heavy burden, the roof of the Lord, especially when the Lord's followers are few and far between. "I was just speaking with Elspeth Grant. She mentioned that Penelope Arbuthnot was planning to expose some local charitasones she felt were being mismanaged. She wouldn't have been talking about the Kirk Restoration Fund, would she, Minister?" Lovat's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as he sank into his leather chair. The woman was a harpy, Macbeth. She didn't want to donate, she wanted to colonize. She promised £30,000, but only if I allowed her to lead spiritual healing sessions from the altar. When I refused, she threatened to audit the books. She accused me of diverting the funds to pay for my sister's medical care in Inverness. It wasn't true, of course, but such a scandal. It would be the end of my ministry. "And so you went to see her yesterday," Hamish said softly, his blue eyes fixed on the minister's hands. "You went to plead with her, or perhaps to tell her that an instrument of the devil shouldn't be making such threats." "I went to find her," Lovat admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "but she wasn't in the lounge. I wandered toward the hydrotherapy wing. I thought she might be there for one of her treatments. The door was open, Macbeth. Just a crack. I looked inside, and I saw the mud, but I didn't see her. I got a feeling of such profound evil that I turned and ran. I didn't kill her, Hamish. I don't have the stomach for it." Hamish nodded, noting the use of his first Nymer, sure sign the minister was desperate for a friend. He looked around the desk and spotted something that made the prickle at the back of his neck return. Resting in a small crystal bowl of paperclips was a single, shimmering green bead. He picked it up, the light catching the deep, verdant hue of an emerald. It was a perfect match for the cursed stones Priscilla had described. "You've a very fine taste in paperclips, Minister," Hamish remarked, holding the bead up. Lovat stared, his eyes bulging. I've never seen that before. It must have fallen from her. She was wearing a necklace when she argued with me in the tea lounge. She was tugging at it, as if she were trying to choke herself with her own wealth. It must have snapped. Hamish tucked the bead into his pocket, right next to the plastic vet seal. The threads were tightening, but they were tangling in a way that suggested more than one person had a hand in the night's events. He left the manse with Lovat still staring at the empty space on his desk, the minister's world crumbling around him like the dry rot in the kirk's rafters. Outside, the rain had turned to a fine, biting sleet. Hamish stood by the Land Rover, watching the spars lights flicker on the hill. If the emeralds had snapped during an argument, where was the rest of the necklace? And why had Penelope Arbuthnot been so neatly tucked into the mud? He realized that while Blair was looking for a tragedy and the nephew was looking for a fortune, someone else had been looking for silence. He needed a sounding board, someone who understood the social heights that Penelope inhabited and the desperate depths that Marcus Sterling was trying to hide. He thought of Priscilla. She had mentioned the embezzlement, and she had known Penelope's fears. But there was also Elspeth, who was currently sitting on a story that could blow the whole case wide open or get her killed. As he drove back toward the village, he saw a black car, a heavy, expensive Jaguar speeding toward the spa. It was Marcus Sterling's car, but the driver was moving with a reckless urgency that suggested the sanctuary was under siege. Hamish followed at a distance, the Land Rover's engine groaning in protest. He knew the next few hours would be critical. Blair was about to make an arrest, could feel it in the way the police cars were beginning to circle the pack. The manor-but Hamish was the only one who realized that the most dangerous person in Lochstub wasn't the one with the debt, but the one with the needle. He pulled into the manor's side entrance, hiding the Land Rover behind a screen of dripping rhododendrons. The hydrotherapy wing was dark now, but a single light was burning in the manager's office. He watched as the figure of Julian Arbuthnot paced back and forth in front of the window, his silhouette jagged and nervous. Behind him, another figure stood in the shadows, a woman, her posture rigid and cold. Hamish realized with a jolt that the social dynamics of the upper class were about to reveal a motive far more petty and far more lethal than simple greed. He whistled for lugs, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the mooching was over and the trap was about to be set. The sleet rattled against the rhododendron leaves like a shower of birdshot, a cold, percussive sound that masked Hamish's quiet approach toward the manor's side entrance. Inside the manager's office, the tension was thick enough to be seen through the glass. Julian Arbuthnot was no longer the arrogant gambler Hamish had encountered at the hotel. His movements were frantic, his hands fluttering as he gestured toward the woman standing in the shadows. It was Penelope's personal assistant, Miss Sybil Vania, woman who had remained so quiet and efficient during the morning's chaos that Hamish had barely noted her presence. Now, however, she stood like a pillar of ice, her gaze fixed on Julian with a look of profound contempt. Hamish adjusted his cap, his mind whirring. The green bead in his pocket and the vet's seal were beginning to form a picture that had nothing to do with the slip, and full DCI Blair was currently selling to the local press. But as he prepared to move closer, the mansion's heavy front doors opened. The silence of the night was shattered by the arrival of 3 police sedans, their tires screaming on the wet gravel. DCI Blair stepped out, his face illuminated by the flashing blue lights, a triumphant roar already forming in his throat. "Macbeth! You're still lurking in the shrubbery like a garden gnome, I see," Blair bellowed, ignoring the freezing rain.
"Clear the way, you useless article!"
"We've got our man. I told you, McLean, didn't I? Follow the money, follow the greed." Blair didn't head for the manager's office. Instead, he marched toward the staff quarters, where a terrified Cyril was being led out in handcuffs by Detective Anderson. The young mindfulness coordinator looked like his world had collapsed into a black hole. He was weeping silently, his white linen tunic stained with dampness and tea. "Sir, you cannot be serious," Hamish said, stepping out from the shadows and adopting his most vacant, wide-eyed look of bewilderment. "Cyril!" The lad can barely crush a grape without a panic attack. What would he be doing killing a lady like Penelope? "Motive, you turnip!" Blair barked, poking a meaty finger into Hamish's chest. "We found a set of the Arbuthnot emeralds hidden in the lining of his yoga mat. The lad was deep in debt to a bookie, and Inverness out mindfulness doesn't pay as well as he hoped. He knew the code to the wing, he knew her schedule, and he knew she was a soft target. He strangled her, dumped her in the mud, and thought he'd be rich by morning. Case closed. Now, get your dog and get back to your station before I decide to arrest you for obstruction of a genius at work." Hamish watched as they shoved Cyril into the back of a car. He saw the green bead in his own pocket and realized that Blair had found exactly what the killer wanted him to find. The emeralds in the yoga mat were too perfect, too convenient, and as the police cars sped away, leaving the manor in a sudden ringing silence, Hamish looked back up at the manager's office. The light was still on, but Julian and Miss Vane were gone. He whistled low for lugs and began to walk toward the back of the estate, toward the small stone outbuilding that served as the spa's infirmary and supply room. He remembered the plastic seal from the vet's bottle. If Penelope had been neatly tucked into the mud, she hadn't been strangled in a struggle. She had been sedated. And Cyril wouldn't know a sedative from a smoothie. It's a red herring, Lugs, Hamish murmured, his voice lost in the wind. A very expensive, very green herring. Blair has his arrest, and the killer thinks they have their freedom. He reached the infirmary door and found it locked, but the lock was a simple one. Hamish had a way with simple locks that didn't involve a warrant. Inside, the room smelled of antiseptic and cold air. He moved his flashlight over the shelves until he found what he was looking for. A small cabinet marked equine sedatives. The spa offered Highland pony trekking as part of its wellness package, which meant they kept a supply of powerful tranquilizers on hand. One bottle was missing its cell, the exact same type of seal Hamish had found near the mud bath. But more importantly, resting on the floor beneath the cabinet was a single damp pink slipper. It was the twin to the ones Hamish had seen bobbing in the mud. Penelope hadn't walked to the hydrotherapy wing. She had been carried there, unconscious, from the infirmary. The red herring of Cyril's guilt was meant to keep the police busy while the real culprit secured the rest of the estate. Hamish realized that Penelope's memoirs and the embezzlement Elspeth had mentioned were the true heart of the matter. Penelope wasn't just a victim of greed, she was a victim of a very cold, very calculated business decision. As he turned to leave, a shadow crossed the frosted glass of the infirmary door. Hamish clicked off his light, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt for his truncheon, but his mind was already setting a different kind of trap. If Blair was about to lock up an innocent man, Hamish had to make the real killer feel so safe that they would make one final, arrogant mistake. He stayed in the darkness, listening to the sound of retreating footsteps, his blue eyes hard with a determination that DCI Blair would never recognize. The useless peasant was about to become the most dangerous man in Lochstub. Hamish stood perfectly still in the shadowed infirmary, the silence of the room punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic drip of a leaking tap and the soft, warning huff from Lugs. The footsteps outside faded into the slush, leaving Hamish alone with the cold realization of how Penelope Arbuthnot had actually spent her final hours. It hadn't been an argument in the tea lounge that ended her life, nor a frantic struggle in the hydrotherapy wing. It had been a clinical, quiet execution. The missing horse sedative and the lone pink slipper told a story of a woman who had been lured here, perhaps under the guise of a private medical consultation or a new miracle treatment, only to be rendered helpless and then transported like a piece of luggage to her muddy grave. He stepped out of the infirmary, the sleet stinging his face, and looked back toward the main manor. The motive wasn't the emeralds. Those had been a convenient discard. A handful of green glass and stone, used to buy silence or to point a finger at a boy who liked yoga. The real motive was the ledger Elspeth had mentioned, the memoirs that would have turned Marcus Sterling's sanctuary into a crime scene of financial fraud and stripped Julian Arbuthnot of his last hope for a bailout. But as Hamish watched the distant light in the manager's office, he realized there was a third thread. Penelope had mentioned being hunted, not just for her money, but for what she knew. He began to walk back toward the Land Rover, his mind turning over the character of Miss Sybil Vane. She had been Penelope's shadow for 10 years, the invisible hand that managed the socialite's chaotic life. She would know the codes, she would know the medications, and she would certainly know exactly how much contempt Penelope held for those around her. Sybil wasn't just an assistant, she was the gatekeeper. If the emeralds were cursed, as Priscilla said, perhaps the curse was simply the resentment of those who had to polish them. Hamish reached his vehicle and sat in the driver's seat, but he didn't start the engine. He needed to think. If Marcus was embezzling and Julian was desperate, they were both obvious choice too obvious, perhaps, even for a man like Blair to miss if he weren't so keen on his lunch. But a combined effort? A partnership of the desperate? Or was there someone else who stood to gain from the silence of Penelope Arbuthnot? He thought of the minister, Mr. Lovett, and his fear of audit. Penelope was a woman who enjoyed the power of her purse, and she had used it to squeeze every secret out of Lochstub. She wasn't just killed for what she had. Lugs, Hamish whispered, staring through the fogged windshield. She was killed for what she was about to say. The memoirs were the key. If Elspeth had the guest book and the notes, then Elspeth was the next logical target. The killer wouldn't stop at Penelope. They couldn't afford to leave the journalist with a manuscript that named names. Hamish felt a cold jolt of genuine fear, not for himself, but for the girl in the red car who always chased the headline without looking at the cliff's edge. He finally turned the key, the Land Rover's engine coughing into life with a shuddering rattle. He didn't head for the village instead. He drove toward the old boathouse at the edge of the estate. It was a derelict place, mostly used for storing broken oars and rotting nets, but it offered a vantage point that overlooked both the manor and the road to the village. If someone was planning to meet, or to dispose of more evidence, they would go where the mist was thickest and the loch was deepest. As he pulled the vehicle behind a screen of gorse, he saw a flickering light down by the water's edge. It wasn't a police torch. It was the steady, bluish glow of a mobile phone. Someone was waiting. Hamish climbed out, signaling for lugs to stay low. He crept through the sodden grass, his boots squelching softly. As he got closer, he heard Voicewo people, arguing in hushed, jagged whispers that cut through the sound of the lapping water.
"You said the boy would be enough,"
a man's voice hissed. It was Marcus Sterling, his usual smooth tone replaced by a frantic, high-pitched whine.
"Blair has him, but what about the girl?"
The Grant woman has the notes. She told me she was going to the police in the morning.
The Grant woman is a nuisance, but she's a predictable one.
A woman's voice replied. It was Sybil Vane, her voice as calm and flat as a frozen pond. She won't go to Blair. She doesn't trust him any more than we do. She'll wait for Macbeth, and Macbeth is currently being laughed out of his own station. By the time he realizes the emeralds in the mat are fake, the memoirs will be ashes, and you will have your investment secured.
"And Julian?"
Marcus asked, his voice shaking.
"Julian is a fool.
He thinks he's in charge because he has the name. Let him play the grieving nephew. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him just to get back to the casinos." Hamish felt the bead in his pocket. It wasn't an emerald at all, it was a distraction. Sybil Vane hadn't just assisted Penelope, she had orchestrated her end to save the very man who was cooking the books. It was a partnership of survival. Sybil provided the clinical expertise and the access, and Marcus provided the motive and the destination. Penelope had become a liability to the wellness brand they both depended on for their futures. Hamish realized then that he couldn't just walk in and arrest them. Blair had his suspect, and without the memoirs or a confession, Sybil and Marcus would walk away while Cyril took the fall. He needed to move the pieces of the board so that they tripped over their own arrogance. He needed to make them think that the useless peasant had found the one thing they couldn't burn. He backed away slowly, the plan forming in his mind with the cold precision of a Highland winter. He would use their own fear against them. He would spread a rumour through the villageer whisper that would reach the manor by midnight that the real Arbuthnot emeralds hadn't been on the body or in the mat. He would let it be known that Penelope had hidden the proof of the embezzlement inside the one thing Marcus Sterling couldn't control, the very mud bath that had become her tomb. "The trap is set. Lugs," Hamish murmured as he reached the Land Rover. "We just need to make sure the rats are hungry enough to bite." Hamish drove the Land Rover back toward the village with a deceptive lack of urgency, his mind occupied by the delicate architecture of the lie he was about to construct. He didn't go to the police station. Instead, he made a beeline for the Lochdub Hotel, where the bar was currently populated by the kind of men who treated a secret like a heavy stone they were desperate to drop. He walked in, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat, and leaned heavily against the counter. Angus, the barman, looked up from a glass he was polishing with a rag that had seen better centuries. "A sad day for justice, Angus," Hamish sighed, his voice loud enough to carry to the corner booth where two local gossips nursed their pints. "DCI Blair is convinced he's got his man in young Cyril, but the poor lad's as guilty as a newborn lamb. He doesn't even know what he's missing." Angus paused his polishing, his eyes narrowing. "And what would he be missing, Hamish? Besides his freedom and his yoga mat?" Hamish leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial stage whisper that reached every ear in the room. "The proof, Angus, the real proof. It turns out Penelope Arbuthnot was a bit of a trickster. She didn't have the Arbuthnot emeralds on her when she went into that mud, nor did she have the ledger. My dog, Lugs, found a bit of a note in her dressing gown on the big men from Strathbane Mist because they were too busy admiring their own reflections. It seems she knew someone was coming for her. She wrapped the emeralds and the ledger in waterproof silk and dropped them into the hydrotherapy vat before she was taken. She figured if she couldn't have her life, she'd make sure her killer couldn't have her secrets." A silence fell over the bar, the kind of silence that precedes a scramble for the door. Hamish took a slow sip of a coffee he'd ordered, watching the reflection in the mirror. He saw one of Marcus Sterling's junior massage therapists slip out the side door, her face pale with the weight of the news. By the time Hamish finished his drink, the rumour would be halfway up the hill to the manor, gaining weight and detail with every tongue it crossed. He left the hotel and made one more stop-thighs time at the manse. He didn't speak to Mr. Lovett, he simply borrowed the minister's heavy iron rake from the garden shed, making sure to be seen by the housekeeper. If the killers thought Hamish was preparing to dredge the mudbath himself come morning, their panic would be complete. Darkness had fully claimed Lochdub now, the sleet turning back into a heavy, swirling snow that threatened to bury the village in a white silence. Hamish returned to the spa grounds, parking the Land Rover nearly a mile away and approaching the hydrotherapy wing on foot. He moved through the trees like a shadow, lugs trailing behind with practiced stealth. The manor was quiet, the blue police lights long gone, leaving only the amber glow of the security lamps to fight the gloom. Hamish positioned himself in the darkened gallery above the hydrotherapy room, a mezzanine used for storage that provided a perfect view of the circular mudvat below. The air in the room was still thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the heavy mineral smell of the peat mud. The vat was a dark, silent pool, its surface occasionally bubbling as the heating elements fought the chill of the night. Hamish checked his watch. It was just past midnight. The desperation of Marcus Sterling and the cold calculation of Sybil Vane were about to collide with their own greed. They couldn't afford to let Hamish find that silk-wrapped package in the morning. Even if they suspected it was a trap, the risk of the ledger's existence was too great a gamble to ignore. A faint click echoed through the room, the sound of the digital keypad. The heavy glass door slid open, and two figures entered, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. They were carrying long-handled pool skimmers and a heavy plastic bucket. Marcus Sterling looked like a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, while Sybil Vane moved with the grim, mechanical efficiency of a shark. "I don't see anything," Marcus hissed, his voice echoing off the tiles. "Macbeth is probably lying. He's a fool, Sybil. He's just trying to look important." "Macbeth is a fool, but the dog is ent," Sybil replied, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "If he found a note, it's real." Penelope was paranoid enough to do exactly what he described. "Now, start dredging. We don't have all night before the morning shift arrives. If we find that ledger, we burn it. If we find the emeralds, we're set for life." They began to rake the thick, dark slurry, the sound of the metal teeth scraping against the ceramic bottom of the vat sounding like a rasp on a bone. Hamish watched from above, his hand resting on the torch in his pocket. He needed them to admit Ito say the words that would undo Blair's tidy arrest and clear the boy's name. He waited as Marcus pulled up a heavy clump of mud, his breath hitching in his throat. "I've got something," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "It's heavy. Oh God, it's silk. I can feel the fabric." Sybil moved closer, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Pull it out, Marcus. Pull it out and give it to me." Hamish knew there was no silk-wrapped package. He had spent the last hour in his station wrapping a heavy stone and a handful of old newspapers in a piece of blue plastic head found in the bin, and Head slipped into the wing through a side window to drop it into the vat before they arrived. As Marcus hauled the dripping, muddy mass onto the white-tiled floor, Hamish felt the moment arrive. The trap was fully sprung, and the rats were caught in the light of their own making. He stood up, the floorboards of the gallery giving a deliberate, heavy creak that made both killers freeze in their tracks. "It's a bit late for a mud treatment, isn't it, Marcus?" Hamish shouted, his voice dropping into the room like a stone into a well. "I'd have thought Yowd had enough of the dirt for one day." The sudden resonance of Hamish's voice in the vaulted hydrotherapy room acted like a physical blow. Marcus Sterling let out a strangled yelp, the muddy, blue-wrapped bundle slipping from his trembling fingers to hit the tiles with a wet, heavy thud. Sybil Vane, however, did not scream. She spun around, her eyes darting upward to the darkened gallery where Hamish stood. In the pale glow of the emergency lights, her face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. She didn't look like a terrified secretary, she looked like a cornered viper, her body tensing as she realized the useless peasant had outmaneuvered her. "Macbeth," she hissed, her voice echoing with a sharp, metallic edge. "You always were an annoying bit of Highland grit, weren't you? Stalking through the heather, listening at doors. You think this little charade proves anything? We're just cleaning the facility. A guest died here, in case your tiny brain forgot." "Cleaning at midnight with a bucket and a skimmer?" Hamish asked, his voice calm as he began to descend the narrow iron staircase, each step ringing with a deliberate, slow rhythm. Lugs trotted down behind him, a low rumble growing in the dog's chest. "It's a very dedicated sort of housekeeping, Miss Vane, especially since you're so eager to find a ledger that doesn't exist, and emeralds that are currently sitting in DCI Blair's evidence locker at least. The glass beads you planted on Cyril are." Marcus backed away, his heels skidding on the slick tiles. "He knows, Sybil. I told you he wasn't as stupid as he looked." He knows about the embezzlement. He knows about Penelope. Shut up, Marcus, Sybil snapped, her gaze never leaving Hamish. She reached into the pocket of her sensible wool cardigan, and for a moment, Hamish thought she might be reaching for a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a small, professional-looking syringe. You have nothing, Macbeth. No witnesses, no proof. Just a fool of a manager and a dog. By the time Blair gets back here, Yow'll be the one lying in the mud, and he'll tell them you attacked us in a fit of drunken Highland rage. Hamish reached the bottom of the stairs, standing 10 feet from them. He kept his hands visible, but his blue eyes were hard, the lazy mask completely discarded. The syringe, Sybil? The same one you used in the infirmary? Penelope Arbuthnot trusted you. She thought you were her shadow, but you were just waiting for the sun to go down so you could vanish her. You carried her here, didn't you? You and Marcus. One held the door while the other held the feet. A very neat, very clinical murder. She was going to destroy everything, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. She was going to audit the spa. I worked years to build this place, to make it the premier sanctuary in Scotland. She was going to turn it into a crime scene for the sake of a few £1,000s she didn't even need. And so you turned it into a real crime scene instead, Hamish said, taking a slow step forward. It's a pity. You could have just asked the village for help. But the Sassenach pride always gets in the way of a bit of common sense. Sybil didn't wait for him to get closer. With a sudden, desperate agility, she lunged not at Hamish, but toward the heavy glass door. Marcus, seeing his chance, bolted in the opposite direction, toward the service corridor. They were splitting up, a classic maneuver to confuse a single pursuer. But they had forgotten about Lugs. Lugs, get Marcus, Hamish commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. The dog didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the tiles, his ragged ears pinned back as he chased the spa director into the darkness of the corridor. Marcus' scream of terror echoed back a second later as the dog's weight hit him, sending them both crashing into a stack of massage tables. Hamish, meanwhile, was focused on Sybil. She had reached the door, her hand hovering over the keypad to lock it behind her, but Hamish was faster. He didn't run, he used the long-handled rake he had brought from the manse, thrusting the wooden handle between the glass panels. The door groaned, the motor whining in protest as it jammed against the wood. Sybil turned, the syringe held out like a dagger, her face twisted in a snarl. Stay back, Macbeth. I'll tell them you tried to rape me. I'll ruin you. You've already ruined yourself, Sybil, Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone. You forgot one thing. The useless peasant has friends. And one of them is very good with a camera. He gestured toward the high window of the wing. Peering through the glass was Elspeth Grant, her camera's flash suddenly exploding in a sequence of blinding white bursts. She had been perched on a ladder Hamish had borrowed from the gardener's shed, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Sybil froze, the light reflecting off her glasses, the syringe trembling in her hand. The fight went out of her instantly. She dropped the needle, the plastic clicking on the tiles, and sank to her knees. She didn't weep like Marcus, she simply stared at the mudvat, her expression returning to that of the cold, efficient assistant. It was the vibrations, Macbeth, she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. She wouldn't stop talking about the vibrations. After 10 years, I just wanted the world to be silent. Hamish sighed, the adrenaline beginning to fade and leaving a familiar bone-deep weariness in its place. He heard the distant, muffled sound of Lugs growling at a whimpering Marcus in the hallway. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his radio, but before he could key the mic, he heard the unmistakable roar of Blair's car returning to the manor. The DCI had likely seen the camera flashes from the road and assumed the press had arrived to steal his glory. Hamish looked at Sybil, then at the muddy bundle on the floor. He knew exactly how this was going to go. Blair would arrive, take the credit, and Hamish would once again be the man who just happened to be standing there when the truth came out. He adjusted his cap and whistled for Lugs. The trap had worked perfectly, but the hardest part of the night was still to come, making sure DCI Blair felt like the smartest man in the room. The roar of DCI Blair's car outside was accompanied by the frantic crunch of gravel and the slamming of doors, a cacophony that signaled the end of Hamish's quiet night. Inside the hydrotherapy wing, the air was still thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the heavy, humid silence of defeat. Sybil Vane remained slumped on the tiles, her gaze fixed on the muddy bundle that had been her undoing, while Marcus Sterling's whimpers from the corridor provided a pathetic soundtrack to the scene. Hamish looked at the syringe on the floor and then at Elspeth, who was currently scrambling down her ladder with the agility of a mountain cat, her camera clutched to her chest like a holy relic. "Hamish! I got it? Every single frame." Elspeth hissed as she darted through the jammed glass doors, her face flushed with the kind of triumph usually reserved for war correspondents. The look on Marcus' face when you mentioned the ledger was priceless. "This is the front page, Macbeth. It'll be the talk of Fleet Street. Ya'll be the talk of the Strathbane holding cells if Blair finds you here with that evidence," Hamish said, his voice urgent but calm. He took a step toward her, his long shadow stretching across the tiles. "Elspeth, listen to me. If you run that story as it happened, Blair will look like a fool. And when Blair looks like a fool, he finds someone to blame. That someone will be me, and it'll be transferred to the dampest beat in the Shetlands before you can print the second edition." Elspeth paused, her thumb hovering over the playback button on her camera. She looked at Hamish, seeing the weary determination in his blue eyes. She knew his game. Of course she had seen him play the useless peasant a dozen times to avoid the very promotion most men would kill for. "You want me to glorify him? Again? Hamish, this was your trap. You orchestrated the whole thing while he was busy arresting a boy for having a yoga mat. I want the boy cleared and the killers locked away," Hamish replied, already hearing Blair's heavy boots pounding toward the entrance. "And I want to stay in Lochdub. If you give the digital card to Blair and make it look like you caught him leading the final stinghell, be so blinded by the limelight he won't notice the gaps in the story. You can still write your exposé, but make the DCI the hero of the hour. It's a small price for a quiet life." Elspeth groaned, but she began to fumble with the camera's memory card. "You're an infuriating man, Macbeth, truly. But I suppose I owe you for the tip about the vibrations." The doors were shoved open with such violence that the wooden rake handle Hamish had used to jam them snapped with a sharp crack. DCI Blair burst in, his face a shade of magenta that suggested he was nearing a physical rupture. He took in the scene with a bulging stare, the kneeling Sybil, the muddy bundle, the syringe, and Hamish standing there, looking as though he had just woken up from a nap in a haystack. "What is this?" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the tiles. "Macbeth!" "I told you to stay at the station. Why is the press here? And why is my primary witness for the Arbuthnot estate sitting on the floor like a discarded rag?" Hamish adopted his most vacant, wide-eyed expression, his shoulders drooping into a posture of dull-witted surprise. "Oh, DCI Blair, sir. It's a miracle you've arrived. I was just out walking the dog, you see, when I saw a light in the wing. I thought I'd better investigate, being the local man and all, but I stumbled right into the middle of your brilliant sting operation." Blair blinked, his rage momentarily derailed by the word sting. My operation? Aye, sir," Hamish continued, his Highland lilt becoming thicker and more deceptive. "I realized earlier that when you arrested Cyril, you were just using him as a stalking horse. A masterstroke, truly. You knew that by taking the boy. The real killers, mister. Sterling and Miss Vane Hereward think the coast was clear. You knew they'd come back for the hidden evidence. I just happened to be the one to trip over them while you were coming up the drive to finish them off. And look, sir!" Miss Grant here caught the whole of your brilliant conclusion on film. "She was just telling me how the Strathbane CID has a genius for psychological warfare." Blair's chest began to swell, the buttons on his coat straining as the narrative of his own brilliance took root in his mind. He looked at Elspeth, who was now holding out the memory card with a look of feigned professional awe. "Is that right, Miss Grant?" Blair asked, his voice dropping into a register of oily, self-important authority. "Absolutely, DCI," Elspeth said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm that Blair was entirely too vain to detect. "The way you used the Cyril arrest to flush out Sterling and Vane, it was textbook. Your Highland strategy will fascinate the public. I have the shots of the suspects being cornered under your direction." Blair snatched the card, his face glowing with a triumphant light. "Of course. Pressure, Macbeth. That's what I keep telling you. You squeeze the village until the truth pops out like a cork from a bottle. Anderson, McLean, get these two into the cars. And get that syringe bagged. I knew the slip and fall was in front the moment I saw those pink slippers. I was just waiting for the right moment to pounce." Hamish watched as Blair's team moved in, the DCI already dictating a press release to the air. Cyril would be released with a gruff apology. Sybil and Marcus would head for the long-term hospitality of the Scottish prison system. And the Arbuthnot emeralds would be found exactly where Sybil had actually hidden them inside, a hollowed-out meditation crystal in Marcus' office, a detail Hamish had whispered to Detective Anderson, while Blair was busy preening for the camera. "You've a grand mind for the law, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap as he whistled for lugs. "He'll just be heading back to the village now. I suspect the dog is hungry, and I've had a pot of coffee that's been waiting since yesterday." Yes, go on then, Macbeth." Blair waved him away, not even looking back. Try not to get lost in the snow on the way home. Some of us have real police work to do." Hamish walked out into the cold, silent night, the snow falling in large, gentle flakes that seemed to bless the earth. He felt the weight of the emerald bead in his pocket. Fake one Sybil had Uzidan tossed it into the deep shadows of the gorse bushes. He had saved his beat, cleared an innocent lad, and ensured that he remained the useless constable of Lochdub for at least another season. As he reached the Land Rover, he saw Priscilla's car parked at the gate, her headlights a warm glow in the dark. She didn't say anything, but as he drove past, she gave a single, slow nod of approval. The law had been served, the Highlands remained mysterious, and Hamish Macbeth was going home to his stove. The following morning, the sun broke over the crags of the Stronleg, casting a brilliant, blinding light across a Lochdub that was now buried in a pristine, forgiving mantle of white. The heavy sleet of the previous night had been replaced by a deep, crystalline cold that made the air sparkle like the Arbuthnot emeralds. Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his police station, a chipped mug of steaming coffee in his hand, watching the final departure of the Strathbane CID. The black sedans moved slowly through the village, their tyres crunching rhythmically on the fresh snow. In the lead car, Hamish could see the silhouette of DCI Blair, his chin tilted at a heroic angle, no doubt rehearsing the speech he would give to the chief constable about his masterful Highland strategy. Hamish took a slow, appreciative sip of his coffee. The bitter brew was exactly what he needed to wash away the lingering scent of eucalyptus and damp mud. Beside him, Lugs gave a short, sharp bark, his ragged tail thumping against the doorframe in a steady beat of contentment. The dog knew, as Hamish did, that the village was its own again. The Sassenach circus had folded its tents and moved on, leaving the locals to reclaim the quiet rhythms of their lives. Cyril had been released from custody with a bewildered expression and a firm handshake from Detective Anderson, who had whispered a sincere apology while Blair was busy posing for a final photograph by the harbour. As the last of the police cars vanished around the bend toward the south, the village began to stir. Mrs. Kennedy appeared on the doorstep of the post office, vigorously shaking out a rug as if to clear the air of any lingering investigative residue. She caught Hamish's eye and gave a sharp, knowing nod. She didn't need to be told the truth. She lived in Lochdub, and she knew that when the big men from the city claimed a victory, it was usually because a tall, red-haired man had quietly shown them where to look. "It's a grand morning, Hamish," she called out, her voice ringing clear in the frozen air. "I hear the Spar is closing its doors for a period of reflection. It seems Marcus Sterling won't be needing those ergonomic meditation cushions after all." "It's for the best, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Lochdub has enough serenity of its own without needing a brochure to tell us where to find it. I suspect the manor will be back to being a pile of drafty stones soon enough, which is exactly how it was meant to be." He stepped back inside the station, the warmth of the peat stove wrapping around him like an old friend. The black telephone sat on his desk, silent and unthreatening. He had already dealt with the morning's only Chrysis, a stray sheep that had found its way into the minister's vegetable perchand. He felt he had earned the right to a long, unproductive afternoon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, blue plastic seal he had found at the start of the mystery. He looked at it for a moment, thinking of Penelope Arbuthnot and the vibrations that had eventually led to her silence. With a flick of his thumb, he tossed the plastic into the heart of the stove, watching as it shriveled and vanished into the orange glow. The afternoon passed in a haze of blissful inactivity. Hamish spent an hour darning a particularly stubborn hole in a woolen sock, his mind drifting over the events of the week. He thought of Elspeth, who was likely already halfway to London with her digital memory card, and Priscilla, who would be back at the big house, maintaining her elegant, distant observation of the world. He was glad for their company, but he was happier for silence. In the Highlands, silence was a commodity more valuable than emeralds, and Hamish Macbeth was a man who knew how to hoard it. As the light began to fade, turning the snow-covered peaks to a soft, bruised purple, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a man with a murder to report, but the polite, hesitant tap of someone seeking advice. Hamish opened the door to find Mr. Lovett, the minister, standing there with a small basket of scones. The man looked 10 years younger, his clerical collar straight and his eyes clear. "I thought you might be hungry, Macbeth," Lovat said, his voice soft. The housekeeper made a fresh batch. "And I wanted to tell you, the Kirk Restoration Fund has received an anonymous donation, quite a large one. It seems someone felt the roof deserved as much attention as the souls beneath it." Hamish took the scones, the warmth of the basket seeping into his hands. "That's grand news, Minister. Truly grand. I suspect the Lord works in mysterious ways, especially when a prominent guest leaves behind a bit of a legacy." He watched Lovett walk back toward the manse, the minister's footsteps the only mark on the pristine path. Hamish closed the door and sat back down by the stove, Lugs immediately resting his head on his master's knee. He broke a scone in half, giving a piece to the dog and taking a large, buttery bite for himself. The spa visitor had vanished forever, but the village remained. The mountains were still there, the loch was still deep, and the useless peasant was exactly where he wanted to be. He looked at the empty bowl of stew on the counter, realizing he would need to poach a salmon tomorrow if he wanted a proper Sunday dinner. The thought didn't stress him, it was a familiar, comfortable challenge. He reached for his book, a well-worn volume of poetry he'd been reading for 3 years, and settled into the chair. The peace of Lockdub had been restored, not by the roar of sirens or the flash of cameras, but by the steady, quiet heartbeat of a man who knew that the best way to catch a killer was to simply sit still and wait for the world to reveal itself. As the fire crackled and the wind began to whistle down the chimney, PC Hamish Macbeth finally allowed himself to close his eyes, a perfectly lazy, perfectly satisfied policeman in the heart of the hills. The following morning, the sun rose over Lockdub with a clarity that seemed almost mocking in its brilliance. The snow-clad mountains sparkled like the very emeralds that had caused so much blood and bitterness, and the loch was a sheet of polished steel. Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, his lanky frame draped in his old greatcoat, watching a silver Porsche being towed onto a flatbed truck. Marcus Sterling's dream of a Highland sanctuary was being hauled away to a police impound lot in Strathbane, leaving behind nothing but a few deep ruts in the gravel and a very large bill for kale juice. Luggs sat at Hamish's side, his ears perked toward the sound of a familiar engine. Priscilla's car pulled up quietly, and she stepped out, her face pale but composed in the morning light. She joined him at the water's edge, the wind ruffling her dark hair. "So, it's truly over, Hamish," she said, looking toward the shuttered manor on the hill. "The lawyers are already descending like vultures. Penelope's estate will be tied up for years, and the spa, well, I imagine the only things finding wellness there now will be the spiders." "It was a heavy price for a bit of peace, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his gaze fixed on a lone heron fishing in the shallows. "But at least Cyril is back to his yoga, and the minister can sleep without the fear of an audit hanging over his head. It's a strange thing, the way people will kill for a reputation, only to lose it in the mud anyway." Priscilla looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "And Blair? I saw the headlines. He's being hailed as a tactical genius. Thea talking about giving him a commendation for his undercover operations at the spa." Hamish let out a dry, short laugh that was lost in the wind. "Aye, the DCI is very happy. He's currently in Strathbane telling anyone who will listen how he outsmarted a criminal mastermind like Sybil Vane. As long as he's busy being a hero, he won't be bothering us here. It's a small price to pay for the quiet, Priscilla." "You're a deep one, Hamish Macbeth," she murmured, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Too deep for your own good sometimes." She stayed for a moment longer, the silence between them filled with the things they never quite said, before she turned and walked back to her car. Hamish watched her drive away, feeling the familiar pang of loneliness that always followed his successes. He was the smartest man in the county, yet he was also the man who chose to stay in a drafty station with a dog for company and a pot of stew for a victory feast. He began the walk back to the police station, his long legs eating up the distance. As he passed the post office, Mrs. Kennedy leaned out the door, waving a copy of the Strathbane Gazette. "Have you seen it, Hamish? Blair cracks the Mudbath murder." "No word on you, of course." "Just the way you like it, I suppose." "Just the way I like it, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish called back, touching the peak of his cap. Back inside the station, the warmth of the peat stove greeted him like an old friend. He took off his heavy boots and sat down, the kettle already beginning to hum on the hob. He reached into the cupboard and pulled out a tin of tobacco and a clean pipe. The spa visitor was gone, and the dark undercurrents that had bubbled up from the hydrotherapy wing had settled back into the deep, cold waters of the loch. He thought of Sybil Vane, sitting in a cold cell, and Marcus Sterling, whose arrogance had been his undoing. They had underestimated the Highlands, and they had certainly underestimated the lazy policeman who saw the world through the steam of a tea mug. Hamish packed his pipe slowly, his movements deliberate and peaceful. He had no desire for medals, no need for the lights of Edinburgh, and no interest in the fast-paced world that had tried to claim Lockdub. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, the steam rising in a gentle curl toward the ceiling. Luggs settled onto the rug with a satisfied sigh, his eyes closing as he drifted into a dream of chasing rabbits through the heather. Hamish leaned back in his chair, the silence of the village wrapping around him like a heavy woolen blanket. The law had been served, the outsiders had retreated, And for one more season, the peace of the Glen was secure. He was PC Hamish Macbeth, the most useless policeman in Scotland and, as he took his first sip of coffee, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.